New Zealand has a legacy of deadly disasters.
I knew my brother and my father were dead. I just knew.
Disasters that have shaped our country.
A catastrophic earthquake hit Hawke's Bay.
A deadly influenza virus swept throughout the world.
The SS Wairarapa slammed straight into the northern tip of Great Barrier Island.
6 celebrated New Zealanders retrace some of this country's darkest days, bringing history alive through the eyes of descendants.
I could hear people screaming and crying and yelling.
The stench was so bad. You could smell death.
It was my Uncle Kevin. He said there's been an explosion in the mine.
In 1931, a catastrophic earthquake hit Hawke's Bay, badly damaging Hastings and destroying Napier. Out of the rubble rose a new city in a style that has made it famous around the world. My family and I live in Lyttelton, Christchurch, and we've lived through those earthquakes for the past 12 months. Believe me, it is a shocking and terrifying experience. We were spared, but the death and destruction we all witnessed must have been very similar to what my mother always told us about the Hawke's Bay quake. Her experiences and the experiences of people of Hawke's Bay made me want to find out more about the devastation, the heroic rescues and the terrible death toll, because this, after all, is still the deadliest earthquake in the history of New Zealand. The morning of Tuesday, the 3rd of February 1931, dawned sunny and still. Another peaceful summer day in Hawke's Bay. Well-known photographer A.B. Hirst was having morning tea with friends at a Napier cafe. It was stocktake time at the Grand Hotel in Hastings. Proprietor Jack Ross was down in the cellar, beneath a 5-storey brick building. At 10 a.m, the bells at the Marist Mission in Green Meadows summoned the students to their annual retreat meditation. Among them, Declan Marr. One of Hawke's Bay's biggest employers, tobacco magnate Gerhard Haschier, was recovering from a sinus operation in a private hospital on Napier's Marine Parade. While those lucky enough to have jobs got on with them, many were unemployed. This was the depths of the Great Depression. As the hands of the clock on the post office building in Hastings approached 10:45, some people reported the air becoming still, birds growing silent, and animals agitated. These iconic images were taken by Napier photographer Arthur Bendigo Hirst. When the first quake struck, Hirst moved quickly to capture the chaos unfolding around him, with little concern for his own safety. His pictures are the only record of Napier after the earthquake, but before the fire that reduced much of the central business district to total ruin. These incredible photos are still safely in the hands of Hirst's descendants. So on the day of the earthquake, how did Arthur's day unfold?
Well, February the 3rd was his birthday, and he was round at the Napier Cafeteria on Hastings Street celebrating his birthday with some friends. Now, for him, the celebration was with a cup of tea. He was virtually a teetotaler. And the earthquake struck. He went back to his business, picked up a camera, and then proceeded out onto the streets of Napier to take the photographs.
So he picked up his camera, and what happened then?
He walked the streets. He obviously ran out of film very quickly because he went down the road to a chemist shop that had been damaged, hand through the window of the chemist shop and grabbed some rolls of film from there. And it was those rolls of film that he was able to continue using over the next few days.
And that all of these albums here contain these photographs of the earthquake?
These are his albums. This is one of the more famous shots in Hastings Street, the shopkeeper and his wife.
Right, and there's already smoke billowing at the back of this one.
Yes.
The fires that followed the earthquake started in chemist shops in both Napier and Hastings. Napier ran out of water, so the fires burned unchecked for 36 hours, completing the destruction that the quake started. It certainly makes you think of Christchurch when you see these photographs. In fact, it's quite shocking, really. A.B. Hurst's two-storey building survived the quake, but it was damaged by the subsequent fire, and he spent a lot of money repairing it. The Hurst building is still standing here in Emerson Street. There it is, ABH, and it looks grand. And believe it or not, my mother, Dawn Mudgeway, aged 5.5, was standing further down the street at the very time the earthquake happened and the building started to fall down around her.
That's one of me there when I was 5. I don't know whether you can see that. Can you see that?
Well, righto, I can see that. Mum's parents, my grandparents, Stan and Lucy Mudgeway, were camping at the Taradale Racecourse, where Stan was helping build a new grandstand. Mum was desperate to visit Napier's new public swimming pool, but Grandma had other plans.
I needed some new shoes. So she said, right, we're going to Napier, we'll buy you a new pair of shoes. And of course, I kept insisting to go to the paddling pool too, and she said, all right, we'll go to the paddling pool.
Their trip into Napier almost cost them their lives.
We walked up to the Hannah's shoe shop, and we were just looking in the window, and my mother felt the first tremor. And I kept saying, Mum, when are we going to the paddling pool? And she held my hand and she said, just a minute, love, just a minute. And then that's when the earthquake hit.
And so what was your first recollection of what happened at that point?
Just being flung away. I mean, I just couldn't stay with Mum. It just picked me up and threw me. And for all the time that earthquake was going, I was so confused, but I can remember my mother screaming, get to Mummy, and trying to get back. And my mother said, I'd just about get to it, and I'd be flung away again. It was just tremendous. You just couldn't understand what was going on, you know. And evidently at one stage, Mum said that she saw the big plate glass windows shatter and come right down where I'd been thrown into the window. But when she opened her eyes again, nothing had hit me. It had gone either side, which was absolutely amazing. Someone was looking after me that day.
And she was all right?
Well, afterwards, she had lost all her fingernails and all her stockings that were all cut, where she tried to get into the pavement to get to me.
30 seconds after the first earthquake, there was another massive jolt. My mum and Grandma weren't safe yet.
When it stopped, a young man came from somewhere and helped Mother and I up, and he kept saying, go to the square, this was Clive Square. And we sort of dazedly stepped off the footpath, and just as we did so, the veranda came crashing down behind our heels. We'd been there a minute longer, we would have been killed there. So that was where we came out, and it was just like you see in these photos, just a mass of rubble and that. But at that stage, dead silence. It's a real shock hit everyone. And then everybody sort of took a second breath and went mad trying to get out of the area. But no, we were lucky, very lucky.
Mum and Grandma had escaped unharmed. But my grandfather Stan didn't know that. He was 6 kilometres away, desperate to know the fate of his family. I can only imagine how horrific the day must have been for my mother and her parents, not knowing where everyone was, trying to get out of town, and of course the mayhem and destruction all around them. As the aftershocks continued to bring down already damaged buildings, the death toll mounted. 9 students died in the Napier Tech. 12 nurses were killed in the nurses' home, asleep after their night shift. A road crew was also buried when the cliffs around Bluff Hill collapsed. In total, 256 bodies were recovered. 2 people would never be accounted for, taking the final death toll to 258. Several hundred were injured. Playing a vital role in the rescue efforts were the 104 sailors from the HMS Veronica. They were joined by other Navy ships in the 24 hours after the quake, searching the debris for survivors, blowing up dangerous buildings, and recovering bodies. Earthquakes are great levelers, not only in the physical sense, but also socially. Wealth, social status, public standing counts for nothing in the aftermath of an earthquake. And there is no better example of that than what happened right here on the Marine Parade after the earthquake in 31. Back in 1931, this was the site of a private hospital. On the day of the earthquake, one of New Zealand's richest men at the time, tobacco magnate Gerhard Haschier, was recuperating after a sinus operation. Gerhard Haschier is a pretty interesting character. He was the owner of the National Tobacco Company, one of the largest employers in Napier at the time. When the earthquake struck, Gerhard was in a room on the top floor of Moore's private hospital. The building would be destroyed around him. He was incapacitated with a large drainage tube inserted in his chest. His bed was on casters and he was thrown from one side of the room to the other. Glass and wreckage lay all around him. Hospital staff began evacuating patients to the beach over the road. But with the building severely damaged and in danger of collapsing at any moment, rescuers couldn't reach Gerhard on the top floor. He was trapped, and the fires that would destroy Napier were starting to burn just a block or 2 away. When a 7.8 magnitude earthquake hit Napier, wealthy industrialist Gerhard Haschier lay trapped in his bed on the top floor of Moore's private hospital. Meanwhile, the smoke and flames of the fires that followed the quake were drawing closer and closer. Gerhard Haschier's salvation came from a most unusual direction. On the morning of the quake, Mervyn Berggren, 23 years old, was awaiting trial at the old Napier courthouse on 8 charges of breaking and entering and theft. Well, of course, your father died when you were quite young. How old were you?
8 and 7.
8 and 7. Do you remember much about your father, seeing he was 7 and 8 when he died?
Oh, snapshots, really. Not a great deal.
Yeah, she's got the better memory than me. I can remember kicking a rugby ball around in the backyard.
And this was your father, and a very good-looking man he is too. Obviously, you both inherited that.
Oh, she did, yeah.
OK, so he went to the war. Where'd he go?
He was in North Africa. He was in the 23rd Battalion.
He was a bit of a miscreant, really, because he used to go across the battlefields or the minefields to nick food.
Steal food from the Americans.
Right. OK, well,
And he got caught one time. That was one of the court-martials.
And that's a long-established tradition in New Zealand between the American and New Zealand troops.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that. But obviously, as a young fellow, he also led an interesting life, because at one point in Napier, he was in jail.
Yikes.
So, I didn't know, I'd forgotten about that, but yeah.
Yeah, we've got older cousins who are about 20 years older than us, and they said that they'd heard through the family that he'd been in prison, but they didn't know what for.
It was never talked about.
It was never talked about.
OK, well, I mean, I hate to be the bearer of interesting tidings, but before the war, he did have a bit of an interesting history. He was, in fact, in the police cells when the earthquake happened in 1931. Now, do you know about that?
No, I just wondered, yeah.
Didn't even know that he was involved in the Napier earthquake at all.
Well, you can spill the beans, we'd like to know.
Yeah, what was in jail originally for?
Well, in our original Evening Post catalogue of what went on, it says he was on 8 charges of breaking, entering and theft. 8 charges.
Wow.
Goes on to say, as counsel said, the prisoner is a young man, 23 years of age, and came of respectable parents.
Yes.
But it says here, this is the good part, the offences were of such as would be committed by a lad who was looking for adventure, even if that adventure were of a criminal nature.
Yeah, I can imagine that from what we know of him.
Right.
Does not respond well to authority yet.
But the good thing was that when he was released as a parolee during the year, now your father with one or two of his prisoner mates went to Dr. Moore's hospital, and I have an account here of how they rescued Gerhard Huschier, the famous tobacco king. This is from Gerhard's son. Father's bed came to rest by the window. The glass was shattered, but from here Father could at least see out and see people below. His anxiety grew to alarm as smoke from the burning town drifted into his room. Fortunately, shortly after, the top of a ladder appeared at his window. And two men in prison garb wrenched the whole window frame out, then lifted Father over the sill and managed to get him safely down that tall ladder and on a stretcher to the beach, where he was made more comfortable with blankets and pillows by a nurse from Dr. Moore's hospital. After which, he rescued a woman from a collapsed wooden building. After the first day, the prisoner was on parole for 1 month. He acted as a cook in one of the camps and conducted himself in an exemplary manner.
About bloody time too.
So your father really was a hero.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
It's an interesting story, actually.
Yeah.
Does it make you feel proud of your father?
Yeah, it does actually.
Mervyn Berggren continued his life of petty crime for a few years to come. But what happened to Gerhard Huschier, the man he rescued? From his sickbed, Gerhard masterminded the rebuilding of his tobacco empire and the repairs to his damaged properties. He owned 3 adjacent houses on Napier's Bluff Hill, including this one in which he lived.
I was very fortunate because I got to know him very well, and he used to take me shopping. He spoilt me, really, and I was very, very fond of him. And once I was very lucky, I was taken to Dannevirke to the Masonic for lunch, and that was a really big outing in the car.
Gerhard was often seen out in this car, one of his 4 chauffeur-driven limousines, and he was sometimes seen with his distinctive Alsatian dogs. During the quake, the brick facade of his factory collapsed onto the street. But just a few hours later, Gerhard's sons had hired carpenters to set up a temporary factory. Within a week, their architect was designing a new building, and it would become one of Gerhard Huschier's lasting legacies. Architect Louis Hay's masterpiece is probably one of New Zealand's most internationally recognised buildings. Huschier oversaw the design, employing the best local craftsmen to create every detail, from the doors and door handles to the stained glass.
It's gorgeous. I do love the door.
Art Deco and Spanish Mission, the fashionable styles of the time, dominated the region's rebuild and have come to symbolise Napier to the world. Another Hawke's Bay landmark, Mission Vineyards, would be the site of a great loss of life. 10 of the 258 casualties died here at the Catholic Mission Station. The fathers and brothers of the mission have been making wine here in Hawke's Bay since 1851. The Catholic seminary moved out a few years ago, but the vineyard and winery remain. There's something rather charming about priests running around gathering up grapes and making wine, don't you think? A day or two before the quake, a number of the brothers were at a holiday camp way over there in Waimarama. And one of those brothers, Declan Marr, decided to walk back to the mission station. That's 45 k's in the hot sun, along with a couple of his mates. They probably wish they hadn't, because this particular location, the mission station, was to be the scene of a major loss of life and limb. At 10 o'clock on the day of the quake, Declan Marr and the other students were summoned to the stone chapel of the Marist Mission Station for meditation. Brother Declan Marr wrote this account of what happened to him here at the mission station during the earthquake, and it's a wonderfully compelling account, quite terrifying when you read it. But his story begins some hundreds of kilometres away in Marlborough. This is the family farm where Declan Marr grew up. It's been in the family for 7 generations and is still run by Declan's cousin. And this would be Declan here with his brother Kevin, am I right?
Declan and Kevin, yes.
What did you think of him? In hindsight, looking back, what sort of a guy do you think he was?
Great guy, yeah. Full of laughter, always laughing, always trying to put a joke over you.
Well, I don't know whether you're aware of this, but there was and is a diary that we have that Declan wrote about what happened to him during the quake. Are you aware of this?
No, no.
A rumbling sound grew in intensity, then the shudder of an earthquake. My first action was to kneel down. The whole building churned and heaved, pounded by heavy blows. Apprehension turned into fear. In front of me, a shower of plaster and mortar. I plunged into the curtain of falling debris. I took 2 or 3 steps when I was borne down by the weight of cascading rubble. Flat on my face, I experienced all the sensations of being buried alive. Above the din rose the cries of those in pain and terror. I prayed fervently. I'd often wondered just how I would die. The thought presented itself to me with all the clarity and realisation of a cold, hard fact. So this is how it is going to be. Were you aware that he was buried under the masonry?
No, I was not.
Right.
No.
The shaking stopped. Somebody started throwing bricks off me. And in no time at all, I was sitting up and smiling foolishly. Then I saw a limp body of a student being picked up and carried outside. He was probably already dead. It was only very slowly that the full realisation of the disaster dawned upon me. The mission station lay in almost total ruin. The chapel was severely damaged, its roof left teetering precariously on top of the weakened walls. A brand new accommodation block that had been officially opened just the day before was also badly damaged. The main building, built of wood, escaped unscathed. After the quake, the chapel was rebuilt in wood.
This is the sanctuary in the chapel, and the high altar, which was toppled by the wall falling in, was up there. Students on this side over here, they took shelter under the seats, most of them. Any of the fatalities started being about here and out on either side of the exit door, because the east wall with the rose window fell in and masonry all came down on top of them and also fell out the other side. There were 5 killed on the other side of the exit door.
So presumably they were trying to escape out the exit.
Yes.
Right.
And Declan Marr climbed over the altar rails and hesitated before going into the falling rubble and went for it and was completely buried. Other fellows who were buried under the rubble and killed, one Bodie Annecy, they hauled him out and Father Kimball anointed him, sacrament of the sick, and he died about 3 or 4 minutes later. Father Leo Spring, he was magnificent in coming in during the quake and trying to get huge blocks of stone off the students' bodies, and the injured were taken down to the drive to get them out of the sun.
Just this here, is
under
it?
the plane trees, and they had horse covers there.
The survivors spent the rest of the day trying to recover their wounded and their dead and to make plans for the burial and the funeral service, but as evening came on, they became aware of a terrible glow over Napier. Declan wrote, "Weary and sorrowing, we lay down to rest beside our injured friends beneath the makeshift shelter. Particularly horrible was that fiery glow over Napier. What shuddering conceptions we formed of that awful scene of death and destruction." But the students' imaginings could not match the real horror. In Hastings, the proprietor of the Grand Hotel, Jack Ross, was trapped under tons of rubble as the fires raged all around him. Jack and Annie Ross had been running the Grand Hotel for 6 years. And it was indeed grand, the largest building in town. 100 rooms, 5 stories, and 700,000 bricks. It was quite the landmark, but the hotel had apparently been built against engineering advice. The mortar had also badly deteriorated over the years, and the front facade was insecurely attached to the building. For publican Jack Ross and his family, the Grand Hotel was an accident waiting to happen. When the earthquake struck, the front facade of the building collapsed onto the footpath and out onto the road. Jack had been in the cellar doing a stock take and was now trapped under tons of bricks and rubble. Cousins Trish Coleman and Jean Taylor are Jack Ross's granddaughters. They grew up here at the Tavistock Hotel in Waipukurau, where Annie Ross and her family came to rebuild their lives after the quake. Jean's mother, Lila, married Cuthbert Crook, known as Crookie, a few months before the earthquake. They had their wedding breakfast at the Grand Hotel. It looks like a very grand occasion.
It was very impressive. It was a very grand occasion.
Now tell me about Jack. What sort of person was he?
Very kind, very generous, and apparently very popular.
One of the things we heard from other people was that he had what was called a counter lunch in those days, the next day, after there'd been a big meal the night before, and it would all be free to whoever was in the public bar.
So that was in response to the depression circumstances that people found themselves in?
And he was generous.
Right. Oh, that's a lovely quality.
Mm.
So what happened on the day of the quake? Can you tell us where everybody was?
First floor up, Mum was the first floor up. Jack was in the basement.
The hotel was completely destroyed.
So Mum ended up in the middle of the street, that's Falmer. Crookie helped Lila, she was pinned. Crookie helped her out on the road, and they started looking they weren't sure where Annie, Jack's wife, was. So they for a while they thought she'd actually been killed.
Fearing the worst, Annie's brother went to the temporary morgue, where he identified one of the bodies as Annie. The rest of the family was shocked to hear the news, but even more shocked when she turned up, very much alive.
So that was a huge relief to them.
But Jack was still trapped in the cellar. When word of his predicament spread, rescuers formed a brick brigade, ignoring the numerous aftershocks. It's said that Jack was still alive and made contact with those trying to find him. The feverish rescue attempt went on for hours, until a major aftershock brought a new crisis. After the Hawke's Bay earthquake, fires burned uncontrolled in Napier for 36 hours. In Hastings, however, the water was still flowing, and firemen had some success controlling the blaze, until a violent aftershock cut the water supply. Without water, firemen could only watch in horror as flames started closing in on the Grand Hotel, where proprietor Jack Ross was still trapped. As the hotel burned, all hope for him faded. All that was found of Jack was a small piece of bone and a keychain.
It was devastating, absolutely devastating. I mean, we weren't old enough, we weren't even born to know about it, but all our lives we were certainly reminded of it constantly, weren't we, Trish?
Right. When you say you were reminded of it constantly, was this because, how would this happen? Would people talk about it at family gatherings?
Yes, people would talk about it, or if there was the slightest shudder or sign of any earthquake coming, you know, they would just go into panic mode.
Do you think it would be fair to say the family was traumatised by what happened during the earthquake?
I'm sure they were. The two oldest girls definitely, weren't they? Lila and Velma, yes.
And they'd lost everything. They'd lost their possessions, their father, their living, their money. They had nothing.
They took over the lease of the Tavistock Hotel in nearby Waipukurau, but the load fell on Annie and Jack's daughters and son-in-law. Annie was to live the rest of her life as a recluse.
Well, we were always told that she was an invalid from the time of the earthquake on.
Do you think she became depressed on an ongoing basis? Right.
I do. Following the earthquake, her life was very unhappy, I would say, and she just couldn't cope with it.
Very quickly, the grim cost of the human toll of the quake began to appear in the papers, and despite all the adversity, people had to get on with what they had to do. The Hawke's Bay Tribune Earthquake editions played a vital role in this. After the quake, phones were down, roads were cut off, and rumours and panic were starting to spread. But these earthquake editions wouldn't have been published at all if it wasn't for the determination of one man, W.C. Whitlock, an old-fashioned newspaper editor who realised the importance of his paper in a time of crisis.
You'd almost call him a burly man. He was tall and dignified and fairly large, and it was a mixture of being stern and perhaps a bit gruff. And he was also a gentle man and kind man, and he used to feed the thrush in the morning, and he took great delight in whistling to them, and they whistled back to him.
After working on several papers in the North Island, Whitlock took over the Hawke's Bay Tribune in 1910. When the quake hit, W.C. was at his desk in this building.
It was a brick building, two-storied brick building, and at the top there was a big edifice that said, I think it said Tribune, and that was extra heavy, and the rhythm, the swaying of the earthquake caused it to fall forward down onto the street. There was a man trapped underneath the building, and Grandfather would not allow anyone else to go in, but he crawled in and brought the person out, and I don't know whether the person was dead or alive.
A dedicated newspaper man, W.C. was determined to get his paper back up and running as soon as possible, despite the fact that his presses were buried in rubble and the building was in a precarious state. The sailors who were assisting with rescues and demolition of dangerous buildings decided the Tribune building was also a risk and had to come down.
And when the men from the Diomede came and said, everybody out, he said words to this effect, well, you're going to blow me up too because I'm not moving. I've got a paper to get out.
Remarkably, the first Hawke's Bay Tribune earthquake edition was on the street the next day.
They knew how important it was that people were informed about what was going on, what was happening. And sadly, of course, informed of the deaths and the injured and the missing. Besides the casualty lists, they also gave information such as where food could be collected, where they could buy stores, for instance, babies' bottles and things like that that may have all been broken. Tremendous amount of information for the people, kept them in touch with what was going on. Came every day, it was free to the people, and it was the first Sunday newspaper in New Zealand.
Is that right?
Yes.
It was basic, but it did the business. And it makes absolutely fascinating reading. A landslide has blocked the Mohuaka River. Banks are not operating locally. All injured have been removed from Hastings to Palmerston North Racecourse, and Maternity Hospital now used as a dressing station. 593 seriously injured were treated in Napier and Hastings. Women and children were ordered to leave and over 5,000 were evacuated. Many of those who stayed abandoned their houses, camping where they could. 400 army tents were set up in Nelson Park to house 2,500 people. Doctors and nurses, medical supplies, food and thousands of blankets came by train from Wellington.
And so it goes on. The most remarkable series of documents which show really the intensity and the agonies and the complications that people were dealing with in the few days following this earthquake.
For my grandfather Stan, the hours immediately after the quake must have been fraught with worry. While he was working at the Taradale racecourse, my grandmother and mother were missing, somewhere in Napier. In 2011, when the second major earthquake struck Christchurch, I was in the middle of the town and thrown over on the ground. My first thought, of course, was for the safety of my family, my wife and children over in Littleton. Now, on the day of the earthquake in 1931, my grandfather, Stan Mudgway, had exactly the same thought. He didn't know where his family were in Napier, and he had to find a way to get there.
He tried to get into town, and of course the roads were opening and closing. And he managed to get in, and he came to where the bridge was up in the air, and he knew he couldn't get up on there, so he headed back to Taradale, got timber from where he was working, piled it on the top of the car, and he also thought, well, maybe the other bridge is down, so he had a little canoe. He tied that on the side of the car and headed back. And when he came to the first bridge, that's exactly what he did. He put the planks up, put planks over and drove up onto it and down the other side, and he was one of the first to get over those bridges. The next one he came to, I believe, was down, so he got the canoe out and paddled across and eventually walked into Napier and found us at the Clive Square.
I don't know how long it took my grandfather to get into town, but it must have been a huge relief when he finally found his family. He brought Mum and Grandma back to their camp here at the Taradale racecourse. It's now a park, but on the day of the quake, it became a refugee camp and temporary hospital.
Now, we've got here some pictures of the tents here.
That's right, yeah, that's some of them. We had, luckily the day before, stacked masses of wood around the big copper, because that was the only heating Mother had for baths or things. And they said that afterwards they told us, the doctors and nurses told, we saved many lives because they had everything there ready to start the hot water straight away. They even had our frying pan pouring hot water into bathe people that were out in the things. And one night, that night, I remember Mother waking me up and saying, come out and get up for a while, let the nurses have our beds to have a sleep in them because they were so tired.
So you lived under canvas for a while and then eventually you moved somewhere else, because we've got a photograph here of a shack.
Yes, well, because of accommodation, people were all out of their houses, and Dad had so much work here to do then, pulling houses back on the Napier Hill and things like that. So he got all sorts of, as you can see, old iron and that, and built us a shack out at Maraea Tautura. And we lived there for several months. Mother
Looks pretty primitive.
It was very primitive. It was very primitive.
Stan spent months helping the people of Napier rebuild. A huge task that provided lots of jobs for people during the Depression. The earthquake affected the lives of everyone in Hawke's Bay, including Māori. The waters of this area have been a rich food source for local iwi for hundreds of years, a resource protected by a taniwha called more more. More more can take many forms: a log, an octopus or a shark.
In this particular area, we had one of our tohunga, a well-known man who dealt with rongoa, that is medicine, Māori medicine. In the morning, he heard shots. And he walked out his door, and where the original footbridge used to be, he saw two youths shooting at something in the water. And when he looked, he was quite convinced that it was More More they were shooting at. And More More is our Kaitiaki. More More was the child of Pānia of the reef.
What form did More More take?
In that particular time, it was in the form of a shark. And he saw the fin quite clearly, heard the shots, witnessed these people shooting, these two youths shooting at this creature in the water. And of course, that morning around about 10 o'clock, we had the earthquake. Our people were quite convinced that it was the result of that incident that caused the earthquake, because we say that More More is a kaitiaki. More More visits when there is something not going right.
Maori believe the fury of More More raised the seabed near Napier by over 2 metres, snatching away most of the inner harbour. Over 2,000 hectares of land suddenly appeared. As the water rushed out, boats were stranded and shellfish exposed. The stench of rotting fish hung over Napier for weeks. The town now had much-needed land for housing, industrial estates and an airport. For Pākehā, it was a godsend, but not so for Māori.
Hapua affected after the quake. How did it affect their ongoing lives?
Well, because they weren't able to gather the food that you used to gather, it was necessary to become part of the workforce to earn. And consequently, many of our people ended up, being the time of the Depression, ended up on the work schemes. And one of those work schemes was digging the channels to clear the water in the land that had risen with the earthquake.
Following the second major earthquake in Canterbury on February the 22nd, I began to write a number of poems about earthquakes. It was probably my way of sort of processing the information of the extreme shock of it all. And some of the lines I wrote were as follows. Despite what they say, the earth is a cruel, indifferent thing. It lumbers around like an elephant, kicking up dust, spinning like a top. It has days of such ordinariness that you can sometimes imagine rivers of glass, offshore winds. And then once in a lifetime, it scares. So this is the memorial to the 258 people who died during the quake. 22 people are buried here whose remains were never identified.
I came to Hawke's Bay to learn more about the 1931 earthquake, and having seen the archives and some of the human cost of the disaster, it makes you realise what carnage was wrought at the time.
But what do you do about earthquakes? I mean, they're horrendous. It's not like a war in that you can look forward one day to an end, you hope. An earthquake comes out of nowhere with spectacular force and causes such enormous destruction. And of course, what do people do then? Well, they have to work together with fortitude and courage and with a sense of vision towards the future. That's what the people of Napier and Hawke's Bay did, and that's what the people of Canterbury are going to have to do now.